Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about what you should be doing before you actually start drawing. Character designing is a lot of fun. And it's really easy to kind of get swept up in the moment and start too soon. These first steps that I'm going to talk to you about are just as important as the steps that I'm going to talk to you about later on down the road when we're actually drawing. And that is to start doing your research, to get prepared, to do all the things you need to do before you actually start touching pencil to paper. Back in my old Disney days when I was working on movies, one of the first things we would do, or I would do personally when I came onto a film, let's say Lion King for instance. When I first came onto Lion King, I wanted to read the script. I knew what my character was. I was doing young Nala. And I wanted to know who she was. I wanted to know how she fit into the story. And so that first thing that I did as I read the script, I read the whole thing to get a sense of the story itself, to get a sense of the tone, but to also understand her. I wanted to know how she fit in. And that's a really important thing because it's not just knowing how your character fits in, but it's really getting to know your character. And so these are some other things I'm going to talk about. So that's what I would do when I was working in the studio environment, when I was working on a production with a whole bunch of other people. Now, some of you out there, you might be just creating your own characters for maybe a thesis project for college, and you're doing an animated piece, or you're just doing something on your own, maybe some comics or something like that. And that's fine too. But what I really recommend you do, and this is something else that I would do later on when I was directing films and we were writing, I was really careful not to dive in too soon, and this is what I want you guys to do. Don't dive into drawing too soon. The first thing you should do is if you're writing a character, let's say it's the hero or the villain or something like that, write the character. I know I'm saying something obvious, but really get to know that character. Get to understand how they fit into the story. Don't start drawing too soon, because what's going to happen in your development of the character from a writing standpoint is you're going to discover things. And those things can be 9 times out of 10 are going to be able to be translated visually. Okay? Another thing, let's say you're doing something very specific. You're doing a pirate, or you might be doing an elephant. For instance, when I was directing a film called The Legend of Tembo a few years ago, and it's a movie about elephants. And what I needed to do, and what I wanted everyone else to do on the project that was working visually, or actually even working on story, is I wanted them to do research. And this is very, very important. It's so important. I can't stress this enough. Do research. Even if you're doing something, you're designing something that you think you already know. Because one of the things you're going to do when you get out there and you start doing your research, you're going to start discovering things that you didn't know. One of the things I like to say is go with what you know, not what you think. And so many times people will jump in to designing a character before they've done that research, and they're doing what they think. And one of the things we like to call it, an example that I use is let's say elephants, for instance. There's a certain thing about elephants that everybody knows. There's certain things. Let's say, elephants are big. Elephants have wrinkly skin. Elephants tend to be gray. Elephants have big ears. All these different things. And if you jump in too soon, that's what you're going to build off of. And it's going to be very cliched. It's going to be flat from a character standpoint. And so once you get in and you start doing that research, you're going to start discovering things that you didn't realize before. Okay? So that's very important. The other thing too, as you develop your character, especially if you're writing your character, if you're creating your own story, think about not just how the character fits into the story, but think of that character as a character. I don't care if it's the hero or the villain or whoever. You want to get into that character's head, and you want to be able to identify with them. Even if it's the villain. The best villains are characters that we can identify. We can understand why they're doing what they're doing. They might not be the best character. You wouldn't obviously do what they're doing, but you can understand them. You can see them through their eyes. One of my favorite villains, this isn't a cartoon character, but one of my favorite villains is Joaquin Phoenix's character from Gladiator, the live action film Gladiator. He's such a horrible, evil character in that film, but at the same time, I felt sorry for him because underneath all of that, he just wanted to make his father proud. And it became perverted and twisted. But you could see underneath, you understood that he was just a little boy, that he knew he couldn't measure up to his father. And there's actually a little bit of sympathy there. So these are the types of things I'm talking about when you start thinking about your character and you start to round them out. You know, what do they want? I've got a list of things that I'm looking at here. What do they want? What is their drive? What's driving them each day? And when you can get behind that and understand it, and see how it fits in the story and see how it fits from that character's point of view, it's going to start not just to get the character to evolve from a writing standpoint, you're going to start to see them a little bit more clearly in your head from a design standpoint. What do they like? What do they dislike? It sounds really kind of corny, but these are things that will, if you can answer these things, it'll start to round out your character. What's their background? Where do they come from? You know, how did they get to be who they are when we pick them up in the story? These are things that I always like to think about as I'm writing before I start to draw. Is there anything in yourself? This is a good one. Is there anything in yourself that you can identify in this character? Even if it's a villain, you know, not just a heroic character or a sympathetic character, but even a villain. Is there something that you can identify with, that you can put into that character? Are there people that you know that you can put into there? Those are all very important things that will help round out the character. Also, is there anyone in your family? Maybe everyone's got a crazy uncle or a lunatic cousin or something like that, or someone that's funny or sympathetic or has had adversity in their lives. Something, is there something that you can pull from within even your own family to start filling out that character? Another thing that I really use a lot, and back on when we were doing Aladdin and Lion King and Beauty and the Beast and some of these films during the 90s, during the early 90s, we didn't have the internet. The internet didn't come along until the mid 90s and onward. And so what we have now is this huge, obviously huge resource to pull from. And one of my favorite resources, not to plagiarize from, and I want to stress this very hard, not to plagiarize, but to get inspiration from, is Google Images. And one of the great things about Google Images that you can do is you can be very specific in your keywording. Let's say I want to do a pirate who is a peg leg, but is sympathetic, has a patch on his eye. I can write all these things in there, and Google Images will come up and throw some very specific images my way. And you're going to start to see things in costuming and just the way the character carries themselves that you wouldn't have thought of possibly if you were drawing on your own. Another thing I'd like to talk about, and this is very specific for your writing. There's two different things. They're kind of shades of each other. One is character dichotomy. Character dichotomy is it's when a character, let's say the villain, Joaquin Phoenix, he's a very villainous character, but underneath, the dichotomy about him is underneath, he's just a little boy that wants approval from his father. It's kind of opposing views that make up a character that make them much more rich and interesting to watch. Okay, so think about that when you're creating your character. Maybe your hero has a little mischievous side. Maybe there's a little villainy in there that kind of rounds them out. Maybe there's some kind of conflict going on between good and evil in their head. Those types of things make for a much more interesting character rather than just the straight heroic character that never thinks evil thoughts, never does anything bad, is only good. It's just, there's no conflict. There's no internal conflict within that character. The other thing that goes along with that are character paradoxes. Now, these are things that I think can be represented visually much more easily. A good example, or I've got a couple of examples. One is, let's say you've got a mobster. He's a hitman. He's something from the 30s. He walks around with a machine gun and takes people out. But He's got a soft spot for kittens and little animals and that sort of thing. These little paradoxes, things that don't quite fit in that character dynamic. And once again, these can much more easily be represented visually, and they're much more interesting to see and see play out in a story. Another one might be, a little girl who likes to dress in pink, and which is very cliched, but she loves to fight. She likes to box or something like that. These are character paradoxes, things that don't quite make a lot of sense. One live action one that I saw a long time ago that has always stuck with me was a comedy film called The Big Hit, where Mark Wahlberg is a hitman, but his character paradox is that he can't stand it when people don't like him, and so he's always drinking antacid, and because he's always upset that he's afraid somebody doesn't like him, but he's a hitman. These are funny examples. These are funny paradoxes, dichotomies of characters that round them out and make them a little bit more interesting to watch. Another thing I want to mention before you start drawing, especially if you're working with other people, but even if you're working on your own, because some people they kind of disregard this at first. And I think this is very, very important. Every production that we work on, whether it's your own or you're part of a bigger studio, every production has an art direction to it. There's a style, a visual style to that film. And one thing that you need to do as a character designer is understand the style of that film. Understand the art director. If you have an opportunity to get with the art director that's working on the same film that you might be working on, talk with that art director. If you're creating your own world, make sure you really understand that art direction that you're going in before you start to design these characters. Because if you don't, and you just kind of discover it along the way, your characters are going to look very, very schizophrenic. It's going to be kind of all over the place. A good example for me is, when I'm working on Aladdin. Aladdin was based on the caricature artwork of Al Hirschfeld, who has a very long, flowing style to his drawing. If you look at the genie from Aladdin, you can see how the genie has this long, flowing look. And then if you start looking at all the other characters in that movie, they all have this long, very fluid look to their designs. And so in Aladdin, I designed Raja, the tiger. And at first, I started drawing real tigers. I went to the zoo, and I actually got into the pens with tigers. This is during my research stage, so I could understand how real tigers are drawn. And then from there, I got a packet from of the art direction from the film, and I really started studying it and understanding where they were trying to go with the art direction, that fluid idea of the look of the film. And so then it was time to start taking what I knew about tigers, what I had learned in my research, and adapting it now to the character of Raja and the look of the film. And so I did hundreds and hundreds of drawings of tigers, just these fluid tigers, trying to kind of caricature what I knew about real tigers and bring them into the world of Aladdin and that art direction. Another example is Mulan. Mulan is a very, very art-directed film. It's very designed. And so one of the things I did on that film, or I did a couple of characters, I did the ancestral ghosts in the backyard at Mulan's house that come alive after she leaves. And I also did the character of Yao from the Gang of Three that she joins up with when she goes into the army. And once again, I needed to understand that art direction that they were trying to create on the film as I was designing Yao and the ancestors. And once again, Mulan also had somewhat of a very fluid look to it, but it was also very flat in its design. And there were certain ways that folds would work and characters' faces would work and that sort of thing. And so I wanted to understand that before I actually started to draw. And another thing I did is I really studied that time period visually that Mulan takes place in. So I surrounded myself with research that I was able to pull from the internet, and then started to draw real characters from that time, so I could understand their costuming. And then I came back, and then I started to look at my characters specifically. And once again, after I'd read the script and see where these characters fit in, And with all the research that I had done, understanding the art direction, then I started to draw. And that's when these characters started to evolve. So the biggest, most important part of all of this is to understand that you need to do your research. You need to understand your characters before you start to draw them. If you start to draw too soon, then you're going to miss out on a lot of great opportunity from a visual standpoint to get some really cool stuff in there. Okay? So before we start to draw, before you start to draw, do the research. Look around. Write. Okay? Let's go ahead and move on to the next video.